Hello everyone and welcome to yet another week of macro. Alright, now for this week and the next one, we will basically be going into more detail regarding the model that we just looked at last week in general. So last week we talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply as a model of the macroeconomy. And now for the following 2 weeks, so for this week and the one after, we will be talking about different schools of thought, different macroeconomic theories that use that model, that use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, but they just put their own particular perspective. They just have their own particular perspective on exactly how the curves of aggregate demand and aggregate supply should look like. So this week, we have chapter 12 from the textbook, the Keynesian perspective. That's what we'll be talking about. This is one particular school of thought regarding the macroeconomy and how it works. And we'll be representing this school of thought with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And then next week, we will have the neoclassical perspective, which is another school of thought about how the macroeconomy works. And again, we will be representing that with aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves, just different ones from the ones that we are using this week. In other words, they'll have different shapes. You'll see. And these two, the neoclassical perspective and the Keynesian perspective, can be described as the two mainstream schools of thought in macroeconomics. There are other schools of thought too. There's a Marxian school of thought, there's the Sraffian school of thought, there's Austrian economics, and there are some other ones as well. That have different perspectives from the ones that we're going to be studying here. But this is still just an intro course, it's still just a principles course. So we will only be sticking to the two mainstream schools of thought, and also to the sort of like synthesis, the combined approach, the way to sort of like a compromise between them, which is what the textbook focuses on. Not so much this week, but especially, well, last week it talked about that, and then also again next week we're going to talk about that synthesis, that combined approach. Okay, so these are the two main schools of thought, the Keynesian school and the neoclassical school. Neoclassical school and everything that goes along with it, including, you might be wondering what the word neo means in front of it. We'll talk about that next week. This week we have the Keynesian perspective, the Keynesian school of economics. Oh, and by the way, yes, this word is in fact pronounced Keynesian. At first when I saw it written, I was like, Keynesian? Keynesian? No, it's apparently, as far as I can tell, everybody pronounces it Keynesian. Okay, so this is the school of thought that was founded by the economist who pretty much created modern macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes. And like so much of modern macroeconomics, the Keynesian perspective came out of the Great Depression, in response to the Great Depression, and in response to the huge shock that this Great Depression was to society in general, but also to economists in particular. So it traces its roots back to the 1930s, the greatest economic downturn in modern American and just broadly Western history. And as I mentioned before, it was this great downturn of the 1930s that got economists thinking really hard about how the macroeconomy works for the first time. Before then, they had just assumed that it's not that different from micro, basically. Okay, so the Keynesian perspective. As I mentioned just a moment ago, both the Keynesian perspective and the neoclassical one, and others as well, in fact, can be represented using aggregate supply and aggregate demand. That's one of the great things about that model, that it's so flexible. What your conclusion is, what school of thought you belong to, ultimately depends on how you draw those curves. I mean, is aggregate supply more L-shaped? Is that what you think? Then you're a Keynesian. Is there a long run aggregate supply that's a vertical line, and a short run aggregate supply that's kind of like a diagonal line? Then you're a neoclassical. So, and other shapes of those curves and other shapes of the demand curve as well will produce different schools of thought. So that's the great thing about that model, about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model of the macroeconomy, that it can be used, the same model, basically, the same model can be used to represent different schools of thought, and the differences between the different schools of thought basically come down to how you draw those curves, what shape those curves are, whether they're more like this, or more like this, or more like this. That's going to make the difference, as we'll see. Okay, So, having said that, the main features of the Keynesian school of thought in macroeconomics, the main building blocks of the Keynesian perspective, as the textbook calls them, are the following ideas. Number one, aggregate demand, AD, is very important. We briefly talked about this last week. This is, the Keynesians are also called the demand side economists. They believe that aggregate demand is the most important thing in the macroeconomy. It's more important than aggregate supply, and specifically that comes down to the assertion that the aggregate supply curve is basically L-shaped, as you'll see in a few minutes. So aggregate demand comes out as the most important thing in the aggregate demand and supply model. It comes out as the most important thing in the macroeconomy. It's the main driving force of how the economy is doing. If the economy is doing well or if the economy is doing badly, that mostly comes down to what's going on with aggregate demand. So aggregate demand in the Keynesian view is very important. It's the most important thing in the macroeconomy. All right. Number two, aggregate demand, besides being important, is also unstable. It changes a lot. It fluctuates. It shifts easily. It easily shifts to the left or to the right. This is another important part of the Keynesian view, of the Keynesian perspective. Aggregate demand is highly unstable. It can easily shift to the left or to the right, and often does. And therefore, it is up to policy, it is up to public policy to make sure that aggregate demand gets shifted to where it should be in order to get a good macroeconomic outcome. So this thing is both important and unstable, and we have to get a grip on it and make sure that we keep it where we want it to be. And number three, wages, and maybe other prices as well, but especially wages, are sticky. Now, this idea of sticky wages, we talked about it a little bit in the week when we discussed unemployment as one of the things that can cause cyclical unemployment, or at least that can contribute to cyclical unemployment. And it is a fact that wages, and to a lesser extent other prices, but especially wages, do seem to be sticky in practice in the real economy, in the world. We observe that companies generally do not cut wages for their workers when they have to cut expenses. Rather, they would prefer to fire workers instead of cutting wages across the board. We talked about that in the unemployment week. So that is a fact. However, it is the part that is debatable, and the part that makes this claim particularly Keynesian, rather than just a universal agreed upon fact, is that it's not clear what the time frame is for the stickiness of prices. In other words, okay, there's a recession or there's a depression, there's some sort of economic crisis or bad times happening. Wages are not going to go down at first. At first, companies are going to fire some people and keep everybody's wages the same. Okay, but how long is this going to last? A year? 2 years? Maybe only 6 months? How long until companies actually do start cutting wages? That's the nuance that separates Keynesians from neoclassicals, for example. It's not like neoclassicals deny that wages are sticky. No, they admit that wages are sticky, but they say they're not sticky for very long. A few months, maybe a year, is how long a company is going to be willing to go without cutting wages. Eventually, if the downturn continues, if the depression continues, the neoclassicals would say the company will eventually cut wages. The Keynesians would say, no, wages are sticky over a much longer period of time. They can be sticky for 5 years, for 10 years. So companies will resist cutting wages for a very long time. So that's the nuance, that's the difference. Keynesians don't just say that wages are sticky, but they particularly believe that wages are sticky and remain that way. They don't really go down for potentially a very long time. And this idea came from the Great Depression, where this phenomenon was observed. The Great Depression, of course, was an economic downturn that actually lasted long enough to be able to see what happens after many years with wages. And maybe the prices of some really, like big expensive things that consumers buy as well, like homes, for example, or perhaps, cars or big consumer durables, refrigerators. Although that's really pushing it. But some Keynesians would say that the prices of those things can be sticky as well, so that they will at least resist going down to some degree. All right, now, having said that, as I keep hinting, the Keynesian perspective, besides being explained in terms of ideas, assumptions, beliefs, can also be represented with a specific kind of aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. And I'm about to show you what that looks like. First of all, remember, price level on the vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis. And then we have the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand on the graph. This is a Keynesian aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. This is what they look like. Now, the aggregate demand here, I've drawn it as a straight line. Your textbook actually has it as a curve. It actually doesn't really matter if it's a straight line or a curve for the Keynesian model. Ironically, even though the Keynesian perspective is all about the importance of demand, it's not really the shape of the demand curve that gives us the Keynesian perspective. It is the shape of the supply curve, of the aggregate supply curve. This L-shaped, or I guess inverted L-shaped aggregate supply curve, that is the thing that makes this graph a Keynesian aggregate supply and demand graph. So ironically, even though the demand side is considered the most important, the unique thing about the Keynesian graph is the aggregate supply curve. And in fact, the reason why the demand side is important is because the supply curve has this shape. What do I mean by that? Well, let's try to shift some curves. Well, let's try to shift the aggregate demand curve anyway, and you'll see what I mean. Before I do that, however, one quick note. The textbook refers to this aggregate supply, this Keynesian aggregate supply, as the short-run aggregate supply. And that is how the synthesis model, that's how the combined sort of neoclassical Keynesian compromise model would refer to it. Because as you remember from last week, the way to combine the Keynesian and the neoclassical perspective is to basically say that the Keynesian perspective is right in the short run and the neoclassical perspective is right in the long run. So for the combined perspective, this Keynesian aggregate supply curve would be the short run, the SRAS, short run aggregate supply curve. But the pure Keynesian perspective doesn't hold this to be short run or long run. It thinks that this is the aggregate supply curve that holds for, this is what it looks like for both the short run and the long run. So I've only labeled it here as AS, as aggregate supply, because that is what it would be in sort of like the pure Keynesian perspective. It would say, this is aggregate supply. It's not just the short run, but in general, this is what aggregate supply looks like. Okay, so having said that, let's shift the aggregate demand curve a bit and see what happens. So we started with AD0, with this aggregate demand curve over here, and then we shifted it to the right. Now AD0, our first aggregate demand curve, intersected the aggregate supply curve on the flat part. Right? It crossed the aggregate supply curve on the flat part. And then we shifted it further to the right so that now the new one, the aggregate demand 1, that intersects the aggregate supply curve right in that corner, right in the corner of the L. Okay, notice something very important. The shift from where we used to be to further to the right increased real GDP, and it had no effect on the price level. Nothing happened to the price level. In other words, there was no inflation or deflation for that matter. There was no change. There was no inflation or deflation because the aggregate supply curve is flat. The flatness of the aggregate supply curve means that there was basically no change in the price level. There was only an increase in real GDP. So this is kind of like something for nothing, right? By shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, we got something good, more production, more real GDP, more consumption as well. People have more stuff. We're producing more stuff, and also we're employing more people because, stuff doesn't produce itself. If you want to produce more stuff, then you got to employ more workers. So we're employing more workers, we're producing more stuff for no downside. There is no downside here. Normally there would be a downside in the sense of an increase of some inflation, but not in this case because this is the flat part of the aggregate supply curve. So there's no downside whatsoever. Only good things happened. So then, of course, you might wonder, why wouldn't we want to do this all the time? And the answer is yes, we would. If we believe that we live in a Keynesian world and the aggregate supply curve really has that shape, then there is no reason for the aggregate demand curve to ever be, we don't want it to ever be anywhere to the left of this corner. We want the aggregate demand curve to intersect the aggregate supply curve exactly in that corner Because if it's anywhere further to the left, then we just have a lower GDP than we could have for no good reason. I mean, there might be a reason, but it's not a good reason. We shouldn't leave it there. We should shift it to the right until it hits the corner. And in fact, this vertical part of the aggregate supply curve is what the Keynesians would call potential output. It's not the same kind of potential output that we looked at in the graph for last week, because last week we had the graph that was the combined Keynesian and neoclassical perspective, which we'll get back to. But right now we're starting with just the Keynesian graph. So in the Keynesian version of the graph, not the combined one, in the Keynesian version of the graph, potential output is actually a maximum, not like last week. This time potential output is a maximum. It's that vertical side of the aggregate supply curve. And if we are anywhere below potential output, then we are on the flat side of the aggregate supply curve, and then we should get to potential output. There's no reason to be below potential output, but being below potential output is always bad, because we can always just shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, get to potential output, get to this corner, and we've gained employment and GDP for no downside whatsoever. So, in the Keynesian view, this is basically how recessions work. Remember, aggregate demand, is unstable. So it's just sort of like, all sorts of different factors, which we'll get to in a few minutes, all sorts of different factors can just sort of like toss around aggregate demand to the left and to the right, just in a normal course of events in the economy. And if it gets tossed to the left, if it gets tossed onto the flat side of the aggregate supply curve, then by tossing the aggregate demand curve that way, we've reduced real GDP, and therefore also reduced employment. We've created cyclical unemployment, and that is what a recession is. So the point where we started, the point where I began this example, this was in a recession. If the aggregate demand curve intersects the flat part of the supply curve, of the aggregate supply curve, in a Keynesian model, if it's anywhere on the flat part, then we are in a recession. To get out of a recession, well, we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, like we just did here, until it hits this corner. That's how we get out of a recession in the Keynesian view. Stimulate aggregate demand. Stimulate aggregate demand is the Keynesian answer to recessions. And it's also the answer to recessions in the combined model, Keynesian neoclassical, because again, in that combined model, the Keynesians are right in the short run, and recessions are a short run phenomenon. So stimulate aggregate demand to get out of a recession. By the way, I think I might as well mention here what we mean by short run and long run. I'll mention it again and again. But in macroeconomics, what we mean by short run and long run is this. Short run is that period of time which is too short for companies to meaningfully adjust their productive capacity. In other words, the short run is whatever period of time is too short for companies to build new factories or to change their technology, to come up with new ways of building things, to invent new robots, whatever is too short for that, too short for companies to change their production line, that is a short run. And of course, this is different in different industries, but for the economy as a whole, we take sort of an average, and it comes down to maybe a couple of years. The long run is that period which is long enough for companies to adjust how they produce things, to change their production lines and their production models. So whatever period of time is long enough for companies to open new factories, to change their technologies, to come up with new machines, retool, that sort of thing. That would be the long run. And again, that's different depending on the industry, of course, but we'll take an average for the whole economy, and the long run ends up being whatever is longer than a couple of years, more or less. Okay, so I'll mention this again, but that's just some information for you. All right, so back to our Keynesian aggregate supply and aggregate demand. What happens if we're already in the corner, we're already at potential GDP, we're out of the recession, but we stimulate aggregate demand further, we push it further to the right, or maybe it pushes itself to the right. Because remember, in the Keynesian view, aggregate demand is unstable, so it can always just jump to the right of its own accord or to the left. So suppose it just sort of like jumps to the right for one of the many reasons why it could do that. What happens then? Let's see. This is what happens, right? The demand curve shifts further to the right. So we went from AD0 to AD1, and now we're going further to AD2, aggregate demand 2. Okay. By the way, I've written YP, potential output, to represent the vertical side of the aggregate supply curve. Like I said, that is a certain amount of output, which in the Keynesian perspective is in fact the maximum output that we can get in the economy. At least with this particular aggregate supply curve, we can get more output if we shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. But that is done by technological change in the Keynesian view and happens by itself over longer periods of time, over the long run. So we're not going to talk about that right now. We're just going to take as given that, in the short run, for now, YP is what it is. It's fixed by the vertical part of the aggregate supply curve. Okay. So what happens if we move the aggregate demand further to the right, or if it moves itself to the right, so that we go from this corner here to somewhere up there? Well, because now we're on the vertical side of the aggregate supply curve, what happens with a further increase in demand is no change in real GDP. We're not employing more people or producing any more stuff because we're already operating at maximum capacity, YP. But we're getting inflation. The price level has jumped up. Now we're just getting inflation. And the reason why that happens, the reason why we're just getting inflation now, is because basically we're revving up the engine of the economy, but it can't go any faster. The demand has increased, aggregate demand has increased, but the economy can't produce anymore, at least not in the short run, to meet the new aggregate demand, AD2. So the only thing that's happening is that things are getting more expensive because people have more purchasing power. So they're trying to throw more money to buy more stuff. They're trying to spend more money to buy more stuff, but there is no more stuff to be made, at least not for a few years. So all of their extra buying power, all of their extra demand, all that's doing is increasing the prices of the existing things. So that's why we get inflation, basically. So in the Keynesian view, as you may have noticed, there is essentially a Goldilocks point. There is a point where we always want to be. And that is this corner over here, right? We always want the aggregate demand to intersect the aggregate supply at this corner over here. If it's any further to the left, then we have a recession, we have unemployment, we have lower GDP than we could have. So why should we accept that? Let's shift it to the right. But if it goes any further, if the aggregate demand goes any further to the right beyond the corner, then it gets on the vertical, it starts intersecting the vertical side of the supply curve, and then all we're doing is just creating inflation and not really helping the economy anymore. So we really want to be over here in this sort of like Goldilocks point where everything's just right, just perfect. Okay, so that is essentially the goal of macroeconomic policy according to the Keynesian perspective. Get aggregate demand, get this thing that normally shifts right and left all the time, get it to go in that corner over there. How do we get it to do that? Through government policy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that is the goal. Get aggregate demand in that corner. And if it's not in that corner, the two situations that I just talked about, either too far to the left or too far to the right, actually have specific names. They are called a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. AD0, the aggregate demand curve that was too far to the left, that would create something that we call a recessionary gap because we're in a recession when we're on AD0 and intersecting the aggregate supply on the flat side. That's a recession. So the recessionary gap refers to the gap between AD0, where we are, and this corner where we could be and should be. So that's a recessionary gap. And AD2, the aggregate demand curve that's too far to the right, that produces what we call an inflationary gap. That's when there's too much aggregate demand, and that's just producing inflation in the economy, so we're too far to the right. And the inflationary gap, again, is the gap between where we are and where we want to be. So this vertical gap over here, you can't see it, yep. The gap between where AD2 intersects aggregate supply and, of course, the corner where we want to be. That's the inflationary gap. Okay, so basically the aim of macroeconomic policy, according to the Keynesian perspective, is to avoid recessionary gaps or inflationary gaps and to put aggregate demand in that corner and get the best possible result. That's pretty much it. And now we go into a bit more detail about the inner workings of aggregate demand. Why can it be unstable, as Keynesians say it can? And what can we do about it? Well, to find out what we can do about it, we have to look at what determines aggregate demand. What goes inside it? Let's just look at the nitty-gritty of it. And this is the formula. You've actually seen it before once, when in a slightly modified form. The NE was a different thing. And we'll talk about it again and again later on in the semester, especially when we deal with fiscal policy. But for now, let's just go over what it means. What are the components of aggregate demand? Now remember, aggregate demand is basically the combined demand for all goods and services that are available to be bought, that are for sale in the economy at a given time. So in other words, aggregate demand is all of the desires of all the different people who want to buy things. So saying that aggregate demand is made up of different components is really just saying that, all of the things that people want to buy can be divided into these categories. Here are some categories of things that people or companies, institutions might buy or might want to buy. Category number 1, and the biggest, C, which stands for consumption, of course. As I said, this is the biggest component of aggregate demand. At least it is in the US right now. Well, has been in the US for as long as we've been measuring it. But it is not necessarily the biggest in other countries. It is usually, however, the biggest. Consumption is defined simply as the money that people spend, or that they want to spend, as demand, for consumer goods, for things that individual people and families, ordinary people will enjoy at home. And it's a very broad category. Well, actually, they're all broad, but think about this one in particular. Anything from clothes to the electricity that you use in your home, to food, ordinary food and groceries, to TV sets, computers, your car, certainly that counts as consumption as well. Furniture, also things outside the home. Vacations. Remember when people used to take vacations? That was nice. Anyway, yes, vacations, and even things like healthcare spending, expenditures on medicine and things like that. Basically anything that a person might spend money on as a final consumer. Anything that you're going to buy or that you want to buy in order to consume, in order to enjoy it, or I guess in the case of healthcare, in order to get better, to stop feeling bad. Consumer goods, anything that, or services, of course, anything that has to do with something that consumers want for themselves, for their own personal utility. That is consumption. Now, why might consumption be unstable? Why might consumption cause aggregate demand to shift left or right pretty often and quite violently or suddenly? Well, here are some issues that can impact consumption. First, disposable income. How much money people actually have to spend on what they want. This is, of course, impacted by the level of wages, to begin with, how much money they get, but also by things like, taxes. The higher the taxes, the less disposable income you have. The higher the taxes, the less money you have to spend on what you want. And also other things that are, I guess I could call them tax-like. Bills, unavoidable bills. So income and disposable income. That's obviously a major determinant of how much people will actually spend, or how much they'll want to spend, how much they'll consume or want to consume. By the way, moving forward, we'll usually take a simplified view of disposable income, where it's simply total income minus taxes. But again, there are different, more nuanced views of exactly what counts as disposable income. In any case, whether it's solo income or disposable income, how much money people get and how much money they can actually spend obviously impacts how much they want to spend and how much they do. So consumption. That's pretty straightforward, obviously, no big deal there. No big surprise there. But then there's something else that you may not have thought about. How about expected future income? Not how much money people make now, or how much money they get to spend out of their income, but how much money they think that they will make in the future, or how much money they expect that they'll be able to spend in the future. And this, of course, is a particularly unstable thing because we're talking about not something that's real, but about expectations, about what people think might happen in the future. And of course, what they think might be accurate or it might be wildly inaccurate. Expectations can be correct or incorrect. Either way, whether they're correct or incorrect, they can impact consumption. If everybody thinks that they're getting a raise next year, they might spend more today because they expect that they'll make more money next year. So hey, why not just indulge a little bit right now? On the contrary, if they expect that they'll make less money next year, then they'll spend maybe less today than they normally would. Maybe they'll be like, I don't know. I don't know, man. Things are looking bad. I'm not gonna go on vacation. I'm not gonna buy that extra thing. I'm not gonna buy that extra, computer that I wanted to buy. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's gonna happen next year. I'm gonna play it safe. So depending on what people think is gonna happen next year or next whenever, they may spend more or less than they normally would. And of course, those expectations can turn out to be correct, or they can turn out to be totally false. Either way, they'll have an impact on consumption. And that is one of the major things, the Keynesian view, the Keynesian perspective actually talks a lot about expectations. We're not really going to go into that very much, but expectations are a major part of the Keynesian view because the expectations are a major thing that causes instability in the economy, that causes demand and actually supply too, but especially demand to just sort of like shift left and right because people change their expectations about what will happen in the future. Okay, so that's another thing. And a third thing that can change demand, that can shift, that can change consumption and therefore shift demand to the left or right, is wealth. Wealth is different from income. Right? Income is the amount of money that you get every paycheck. Wealth is the amount of money that you have, the big pot. The value of everything you own plus the money that you have in the bank. So, since I just said the value of everything you own, obviously that would be impacted by the value of something big that you own, like say a house, right? House prices are going to impact people's wealth because your house is for most people the most expensive thing you own, and the biggest part of your wealth is in your house. So, house prices are going to impact people's wealth, and that will impact their consumption in that, well, simply put, people with more wealth have more of a cushion. And so they're more likely to spend because they'll be like, hey, if we get into any trouble, we can just draw some money from the bank or whatever. And people with very little wealth and very little expectations that they'll get wealth in the future might be more apprehensive and less likely to consume, less likely to spend. So that's another thing that can impact consumption and therefore shift aggregate demand to the left or to the right, and in an unpredictable sort of way, especially because we're talking about the unpredictability of the housing market, but also combined with expectations, because it's not just the housing market in the present, but what people think is going to happen in the housing market in the future that can impact how much they spend in the present. So a lot of instability. That's the Keynesian perspective. So that was C. Next, I. And I stands for investment. In this case, I stands for investment. Now, investment is a type of spending. The desire to invest is a type of demand. You may not usually think of it that way, but remember what investment means. It means buying something. Whether you're investing in a new business, you're opening a new business, you're investing. Okay, what does that mean exactly? What are you doing? Well, you're buying a building or a plot of land, or at least renting it, again, spending money, and then you're putting things in it, to build your business, and then hiring people, paying them wages. You're spending money. Investing means spending money. Usually spending money to buy some stuff for your company. Actually, the definition of investment is expenditures that are made in the expectation of future profits. So in other words, investment is any time you spend money with the hope that you're going to get more money out of it in the future. So that's the difference between consumption and investment. Consumption is spending money on something that you enjoy or that you need. Investment is spending money on something that you don't particularly care about, but that you are hoping to get more money out of in the future. That is investment. But it's still a type of spending. Usually, obviously done by businesses, corporations, companies, who are investing in anything from offices to factories to I don't know, airlines investing in new airplanes. You can also invest in the stock market, of course, because what are you doing when you're on the stock market? Well, you're buying things, right? Buying stocks and bonds. Why are you buying them? You really like them? You enjoy them? No, you're buying them because you expect that they'll get you more money in the future. So it's investment. It's buying something, stocks or bonds on the stock market, in the hope of future profits. Okay, so that's investment. What can change investment? What can make it up or down, and thereby make aggregate demand shift to the left or right? Well, expectations. Once again, expectations are always a big thing. In this case, expectations of future profits. What do you think the economy is going to be like in 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years? Do you think there's going to be a big boom? In that case, you might invest a lot. You might spend a lot of money to build a new business because you expect that business is going to be good. Or do you expect that business is going to go horribly in the next year? Maybe because of a pandemic or something. Then you might invest less or maybe not invest at all based on what you think is going to happen in the future. So again, those expectations might be correct or incorrect. What you think is going to happen may or may not actually happen, but either way, it will affect how you act, what you do, what aggregate demand is in the present. And then another thing, this is all from the textbook, by the way. I'm not writing them on the board because these are all mentioned in the textbook explicitly. Another thing that can impact investment and thereby shift aggregate demand is the interest rate. The interest rate, the amount of money that you have to pay in order to borrow money, or the rate that you have to pay in order to borrow money. How does that impact investment? Well, it impacts investment because in practice, most investment is financed by borrowing, by credit. In other words, most companies, most businesses, they'll borrow money from a bank, use that money to invest, and then pay the bank back out of the profits that they make, hopefully, if they make them. So credit, borrowing, has a lot to do with how much companies invest. So therefore, the interest rate, how much you have to pay to borrow money, can have a big impact on investment. All right, next letter. G, that stands for government spending. And this is pretty straightforward. It's impacted by government decisions, by politics. In fact, this is the main, or one of the two main things that we would use as at the policy level. If we're the government, obviously government spending is one of the two main things that you can use to shift aggregate demand to the left or to the right. If, government spending obviously is spending. It's the government buying stuff, spending money to buy stuff. Therefore, it's directly part of aggregate demand. You can think of it as government consumption plus investment all rolled into one category, G. It's any money that the government spends, whether to pay people's wages, for government employees, or to build new government buildings, or for any other purpose, build new roads. So any money that the government spends. Obviously, the government controls or can make the decisions regarding how much money it will spend. And by spending more or less, it can shift aggregate demand to the left or to the right. So if the government spends more, aggregate demand shifts to the right. If the government spends less, it shifts to the left. It's pretty straightforward. So this is actually the main tool that the government will use to make those shifts happen. And finally, the thing that I've written as NE, also can be written as X minus M, is net exports. Now, the reason why this is there is basically just a matter of definition. It's because we define aggregate demand specifically as the demand for goods produced in the United States. Therefore, demand for goods produced outside of the United States, like if people buy stuff produced in another country, that doesn't count. So we subtract that from AD, that's imports. There's going to be a minus sign in front of imports. Whereas other countries' demand for stuff produced in the United States is going to count towards AD, so that's a positive. That's, exports are a positive to aggregate demand and imports are a negative. Now, that doesn't mean that imports are bad for people or that exports are necessarily good. It just means that, by definition, aggregate demand is the demand for stuff produced in the United States and not the demand for stuff produced somewhere else. That's how it works, and that's why this term is here. It's just a matter of definition. And of course, net exports, in other words, exports minus imports, can be affected by all sorts of things related to international trade. Anything that changes international trade in some way, including government policy, can impact this. So, we've just gone over a bunch of stuff. Consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. And all of these things, each of them in particular, can be impacted, can be changed by all sorts of factors, including expectations, in other words, what people think is going to happen in the future, whether true or false, politics, all sorts of things, international events and trade. So putting all of these things together, putting all of these different factors that can change all of these different parts of aggregate demand together, we get a picture of something that's very hard to predict, right? This is the Keynesian argument. Aggregate demand is unstable. It can shift to the left or to the right by itself with very little way to predict what it's going to do because it's got so many moving parts and so many things that can push it in one direction or the other. So that is, like I said, the Keynesian argument for why aggregate demand is as fickle as it is. And then, of course, we need the government, through government spending, also through taxes, I'll get that in a moment, or maybe longer than a moment, but through government spending and through taxes, we need the government, according to a Keynesian perspective, to make sure that aggregate demand stays as close as possible to this corner, that it hits aggregate supply in the corner and not too far to the left or too far to the right, so that we don't get recessionary or inflationary gaps. By the way, as a last note, all of these things that I just talked about regarding factors that can affect consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and can therefore shift the aggregate demand curve, they are very neatly summarized in your textbook on page 301. Definitely check it out. It's going to be important. Okay, so aggregate demand is unstable. That's why we need government policy to try to get it as close to that corner as possible. But there's a third aspect of the Keynesian perspective. By the way, in the textbook, there's no clear list like this, and the textbook kind of talks about two aspects of the Keynesian perspective, and that's because it combines the first two. What I called aggregate demand is very important, and aggregate demand is unstable. It sort of combines those into one. That's a point about aggregate demand, and then it says there's another point regarding wage and price stickiness. Okay, so let's talk about wage and price stickiness then, point 3 or 2, depending on how you count these. What's the deal with that? Well, remember from unemployment, when we talk about sticky wages, what we're talking about is the fact that a company is doing badly and they're not cutting wages of their workers. Rather, they are firing some workers instead and keeping everyone else on staff on the same wage. And as I said some time ago, companies can also be reluctant, at least according to some Keynesians, companies can also be reluctant to change other prices. This reluctance to change prices, whether the price of labor, the wage, or other prices, which, by the way, is represented in the textbook with a series of graphs, a series of microeconomic graphs on page 303. Do not confuse those microeconomic graphs showing stickiness of prices in the labor market or in the goods market. Do not confuse those with the aggregate supply and demand graph, okay? Those are just showing wage and price stickiness in specific markets at the micro level. Okay, so anyway, this wage and price stickiness, what does it do? How does it figure into this model? Because it kind of seems like we just pretty much covered everything by talking about aggregate demand. Well, not quite. The wage and price stickiness actually figures into the reason why the aggregate supply curve has such a flat lower part, I guess. The early part of the aggregate supply curve is so flat. That is, the reason why it looks so flat, the reason why we draw the Keynesian aggregate supply curve with such a flat part over here is because of the assumption of wage and price stickiness. This flat part of the aggregate supply curve is telling us that the price level isn't really going to go up or down until we hit potential output, potential GDP. Below potential output, nothing's going to happen to the price level. It's just going to stay where it is. In other words, prices will not change very much unless we're already at potential output. In other words, prices are very sticky, wages especially, but other prices as well, are very sticky unless we're at potential output. Or in yet other words, in another way of saying it, if we're not at potential output, if we're below that corner, then companies will not cut wages or increase wages for that matter. Rather, they will just fire people or hire people instead. And likewise with other prices, the prices of the goods they sell, they will at least try not to change them very much. Now, do we observe this in real life? Yes, especially for wages, to a lesser degree for other prices. We do observe that even non-wage prices have at least some stickiness. In other words, they may not be completely unchanged in response to changes in demand, but they do change slowly with a lag when it comes to changes, when it comes to responding to changes in aggregate demand. We do observe this, especially, like I said, for wages, less so for other prices. They don't change as much as you'd expect if this was if you were just looking at a standard supply and demand model. What's going on? Why are wages especially, but also to some degree other prices, sticky? Well, when it comes to wages, we already discussed several different theories in the week on unemployment. But essentially, all of those different theories about why wages are sticky come down to this idea that cutting wages reduces morale or the incentive to work among the people who are still employed, or otherwise hurts the company, such that it's better for a company to just fire a few people than cut everybody's wages. Because, like I said, all of the different theories come down, there are different theories about how this works, but basically they all say there's something about cutting wages that makes the workers work for that company, it makes them less productive. Whether it's their morale, they feel stressed, or maybe it's some other psychological thing, or maybe it's because some of them are going to voluntarily quit or get upset because of the cut wages, or for whatever other reasons. It makes more sense, it would seem, for a company from the point of view of profitability to fire a few workers rather than cutting everybody's wages across the board. We talked about that. What about other prices? Why might other prices also be sticky? Well, the reasons for the stickiness of other prices that are not wages, the reasons generally fall under the category of something that economists call menu prices. This comes from the idea that you're a restaurant and you're printing a menu, and if you want to change the prices of the various dishes that you serve, then you're going to have to print another menu, which will cost money. Now, obviously, not all businesses are restaurants, and not all businesses have menus, but the idea is that changing the prices of your goods or services that you are selling, the act of changing prices in and of itself has costs. It's not free. You can't just change prices willy-nilly anytime you want, 10 times a day, and expect that nothing bad will happen to you. If you change prices too often, or sometimes if you change prices at all, more than a couple of times a year, that will negatively impact your business somehow. That's the idea behind menu prices or menu costs. It costs you something. Maybe not literally money, but it costs you something. Maybe it's reputation. It costs you something whenever you're changing your prices. Obviously, this does not apply to all companies, but if it applies to enough companies in the economy that enough companies don't want to change their prices or don't want to change their prices too often because of whatever this is costing them, whether it's money or reputation or contracts, then it adds up if enough companies are like this, and then you can get this phenomenon of sticky prices. Prices don't change very much because there's a lot of companies that don't want to change their prices because they have something to lose by changing their prices. And again, it could be literal menus or catalogs or whatever, some sort of list of prices that you're printing or at least putting out there to your customers. And if you're going to change your prices, then your customers are going to get upset, or it's going to cost you literal money to send them another catalog. It doesn't really happen very much anymore because of the internet. So it might not be a literal menu, but it can be reputation with your customers. I mean, if you're a customer, not so much an individual consumer, but like a bulk, another company that is buying in bulk, and your supplier, the company that you're buying a large quantity of something from, maybe you're buying a large quantity of steel from some steel company, and they keep changing the price on you. They're like, oh, no, actually, no, our steel is not what we said last week. It's actually different. And then the next week it's going to be like, no, we changed it again. It's a different price now. You might just get annoyed and be like, you know what? We're done. I'm going to buy from some other company that can tell me a price and stick to it and not change it every week. That can happen. So the company that keeps changing its prices has something to lose. That's an example of something of basically what is called a menu cost that can cause sticky prices. It can also, impact your reputation. Prices can be locked in because of contracts, especially long-term contracts. If you signed a contract that said you are going to deliver this much product for this price 6 months from now, then you have to deliver that product for this price 6 months from now, even if you wish you could have changed the price in the meantime. So long-term contracts can lock in prices and therefore make prices sticky, difficult to change. Especially since, you have a contract with some guy, you're selling him your product at $10. You can't at the same time, sell it to somebody else at $15. That's gonna make you look bad. So that can impact your reputation. Okay, so menu cost, the cost in terms of money or reputation or contract obligations that prevent companies from changing prices too much. That can make prices sticky. So that, combined with the stickiness of wages, results in this sort of flat aggregate supply curve below potential output. By the way, the textbook refers to something called the coordination argument for the stickiness of wages. That's basically another name for the stickiness of wages. It's another name for this phenomenon that we observe where companies are reluctant to cut wages. And the reason why it's called a coordination argument is because of the idea that if we were better coordinated, then we could actually cut wages across the board. If we could all get together and talk about it and be like, hey, guys, look, better to have lower wages than to have unemployment, then maybe we could get that done, but because of lack of coordination, we're not getting it done. That's why it's called a coordination argument. In any case, stickiness of wages and other prices. The thing that makes the aggregate supply curve like this, which is an essential part of the Keynesian analysis of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And we are almost ready to wrap up. That will happen in the next video. Before I end this video, however, a quick reminder of what the Keynesian version of the aggregate supply and demand graph looks like. Or perhaps I should say what the ideal situation looks like, because that is what I have drawn. The aggregate demand curve intersecting the aggregate supply curve in that corner, in that perfect place where we want it to be. This is the goal of macroeconomic policy according to the Keynesian perspective. Get the aggregate demand to intersect the aggregate supply curve in that corner. The aggregate supply curve looks like this, like sort of this inverted L shape, mostly because of sticky prices and wages. And aggregate demand is prone to shifting kind of unpredictably left and right. Shifts to the left cause recessions. And the only way to get out of those recessions is to use government policy to stimulate demand and get it back into this corner. But we don't want to stimulate demand too much, because then we'll get on the inflationary side, on the vertical side, we'll get an inflationary gap. And that would also be bad. Also, we can get an inflationary gap just by itself through the normal shifts of aggregate demand. And in that case, we might want to use government policy to shift aggregate demand to the left. Again, we're trying to get it to go in that corner. And finally, an important aspect of the Keynesian analysis. In the pure Keynesian analysis, in the pure Keynesian theory, in the pure Keynesian perspective at least, there is no automatic mechanism that will make aggregate demand go back into that corner, that will get the economy back to potential GDP and back to full employment unless we make it go there, unless some sort of government action makes it go there. Otherwise, aggregate demand can just sort of like hang out here on the left for years, decades even, or even hang out there on the right for years, decades even. But the real concern is over here on the left. The Keynesian perspective interprets the Great Depression as being a leftward shift in aggregate demand. You know, there was a shift in aggregate demand. People and businesses, people started consuming less because of the initial shock of the stock market collapse, and businesses started investing less because of that initial shock. So once you got that initial shock, you know, something bad happens, the big stock market crash of 1929. So businesses get scared and stop investing, or they invest less. Consumers also get scared and they buy less. That shifts aggregate demand to the left, and then everybody just sort of like stays there, you know. The economy is obviously doing badly. Businesses look at this and they're like, yeah, we're not investing, we're going to wait for the economy to get better. But their lack of investment, the fact that they're not spending money, the fact that they're not buying things, is preventing the economy from getting better. And again, the same with consumers. Consumers are like, yeah, you know, I don't know if I'm going to have an income next year, so I'm not going to spend money on anything. I'm just going to tighten my belt and only buy absolute necessities. Again, that keeps aggregate demand on the left and prevents the economy from getting better. So this sort of like pessimism, you know, a fear about the future, bad expectations about the future on both these part of businesses and consumers can get us in a situation where aggregate demand shifts to the left and stays there, and we are in a recession for the foreseeable future unless the government does something to move it back to the right, such as, for example, increasing government spending or cutting taxes. We'll talk more about that and about something called the Phillips curve in the next video. So, see you then.